Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc. Today we're going to be talking about the Kriss Donald case, a 15-year-old boy from Glasgow who was murdered back in 2004.
Yeah, this case really shook a lot of people, not just because of how brutal the crime was, but also everything that happened during the investigation and trial.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly happened to Kriss? I know he was abducted.
Yeah, he was abducted in broad daylight, right off the street.
Oh, wow.
And the sources say it was a racially motivated attack. They just grabbed him because he was white, forced him into a car, and drove him around. They even went as far as Dundee and back.
That's terrifying. Imagine being his family, not knowing where he was or what was happening to him.
It must have been awful. And the sources say that Kriss actually tried to contact his family during the abduction, but his captors stopped him. Eventually, they took him to the Clyde Walkway, which is near Celtic Football Club's training ground. It's kind of isolated.
And that's where it gets really bad, right?
Right. This is where things turn horrific.
What did they do to him?
Kriss was stabbed multiple times. 13 stab wounds, to be exact.
Uh-huh.
And the sources are pretty graphic here. They say 3 of his arteries were severed, his lung was punctured, and his liver and kidney were damaged. Then they doused him with gasoline, set him on fire, and just left him there to die.
To even be conscious for any part of that,
Yeah.
it's unimaginable. The sources mention that he tried to put the flames out himself by lying in a puddle.
Yeah, that's where they found his body. The level of cruelty in this case is just... It's horrifying.
Absolutely. So who was responsible for this? The sources mention a few names.
At first, the police arrested a man named Danish Shahid, and he was convicted. But as the investigation went on, it became clear that more people were involved.
Right. One of the sources, a detective who worked the case, talked about how they figured out who else was involved.
Oh, right. Shahid Mohammad. He had already been convicted for the abduction, but then he ended up testifying against the Shahid brothers, Imran and Zishan, and there was also Mohammed Mushtaq.
So his testimony was crucial in identifying the main people behind the attack.
Yeah. The Shahid brothers were pretty notorious in the Pollock Shields area. They ran a gang and pretty much controlled things there.
And after the murder, didn't they flee to Pakistan?
That's right. The Shahid brothers and Mushtaq, they all went to Pakistan. Getting them back to stand trial wasn't easy at all. Back then, the UK didn't have an extradition treaty with Pakistan.
So how did they get them back?
Well, it took a lot of work. A British MP of Pakistani origin, Mohammad Sarwar, got involved and really pushed for extradition.
I read that he actually received death threats because of it. That's incredible.
It really is. He put himself at huge risk to make sure those responsible for Kriss's death would be held accountable. And, the Pakistani police put a lot of resources into finding them, too. It shows how seriously they took this case.
So what happened when they were finally extradited? I think the trial was in 2006, right?
Yeah, all 3 were found guilty of Kriss's murder. They got life sentences. Imran Shahid, the one considered the ringleader, he got a minimum of 25 years. Zishan Shahid got 23 years, and Mushtaq got 22.
Sounds like justice was served. But I know there were a lot of controversies surrounding this case, too, like the media coverage, for example.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Some sources claim that the media coverage in England wasn't as extensive as it was in Scotland.
Right, and that it didn't really focus on the racial motivation behind the crime.
Yeah, there were accusations that the English media kind of downplayed the fact that Kriss was targeted because he was white. It raised questions about bias in reporting, about whose stories get told and how. And then there were the claims that the police were hesitant to investigate Asian gangs properly because they didn't want to be seen as racist.
That's a really complicated issue, and the fact that these accusations came up at all shows just how sensitive this case was.
Absolutely. This case forced people to confront some really uncomfortable truths about racism and how it can affect anyone.
It definitely wasn't just a straightforward murder case. There were so many layers to it.
Right. And it had a huge impact on so many people, Kriss's family, of course, but also the community as a whole.
Yeah, I read about all the tributes to Kriss. The song by Las Vegas, Flowers and Football Tops, and the memorial bench by the River Clyde.
It's a reminder that Kriss was just a kid. He had his whole life ahead of him, and it was taken away in such a brutal way.
It's heartbreaking. But the impact of this case went beyond Kriss's family, too, right? I mean, Imran Shahid faced a lot of violence in prison.
Yeah, he became a target for attacks from other inmates. He was constantly under threat because of what he did. He even had to fight legal battles over being kept in solitary confinement and even over his belongings.
It seems like the violence that started with Kriss's murder continued to have these ripple effects, even within the prison system.
It's almost like a cycle, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it makes you think about the long-term consequences of hate and violence, how they can touch so many lives in ways we might not even imagine.
And the sources mention that the mothers of both Kriss Donald and Scott Adams, the inmate who attacked Shahid in prison, they both experienced this incredible loss.
Yeah, that's a really interesting aspect of the case. Two mothers both grieving the loss of their sons, but connected through this web of violence and tragedy. Their stories really highlight how complicated and far-reaching the impact of this case has been.
It's a reminder that there's always more to the story than just the headlines. There are human lives behind every crime, and the consequences can be felt for years, even decades afterwards.
You're right. The Kriss Donald case is a stark reminder of that. It raises so many questions about justice, about accountability, about the enduring impact of hate and violence on individuals and communities. It makes you wonder about, how certain cases capture the public's attention more than others.
It's clear now, looking back, that this case had an impact that went way beyond just the initial tragedy.
Absolutely. It really ignited a national conversation about hate crimes, about racism, about all the different facets of justice.
It challenged a lot of people's assumptions about, who could be a victim of hate and who could be the perpetrator, because it wasn't the traditional narrative that people were used to.
Right. And, something that always stuck with me was how Chris's mother, Angela Donald, she always resisted those who tried to frame the case as solely about race.
Yeah, I remember that.
Even in the face of such unimaginable loss, she wanted people to see her son as a victim of gang violence, not just racial hatred. I think that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah. It's like she was saying, hate can come from anywhere, and it can hurt anyone.
Exactly. It's a message we all need to remember.
This case gives us a lot to think about, especially when you consider, the long-term effects it had on everyone involved.
You're right. It's not just about the immediate aftermath. The fact that Imran Shahid, the one who planned this horrific crime, ended up being a victim of violence himself while he was in prison. It adds another layer of complexity to the whole story.
It really does. It makes you wonder about that whole cycle of violence. Can you ever really achieve justice when hate just keeps breeding more hate?
And it raises some really fundamental questions about the purpose of punishment. Are we aiming for revenge or rehabilitation? And how do we strike that delicate balance between keeping prisoners safe but also respecting their basic human rights?
This is one of those cases that it stays with you, doesn't it? Even though it happened years ago, the issues it raised are still so relevant today.
I completely agree. Racism, gang violence, media bias, these are problems we're still wrestling with as a society. I think the Kriss Donald case serves as this harsh but necessary reminder that the fight for equality, the fight for justice, it's far from over.
What strikes me is, how much of an impact individual actions can have. Think about MP Mohammad Sarwar, risking his own life to make sure those responsible for Chris's death were brought back to Scotland. And Angela Donald, choosing to respond to this horrific tragedy with something other than hate.
Their courage is remarkable. It shows that even in the face of such darkness, people can choose to stand up, to fight for what's right, and really make a difference.
That's a powerful message. It reminds us that we each have a role to play creating a world where this kind of thing never happens again.
This case really forced society to confront how we understand racism. The sources talk about how the traditional definition of racism, that prejudice plus power idea, well, it was really challenged by cases like this one.
So you're talking about the idea that racism could only exist if the person committing the act had more power than the victim.
Exactly. But cases like Kriss Donald's, where you had a white victim targeted by perpetrators from a minority group, it complicated that traditional definition. It showed its limitations.
It forced people to acknowledge that hate isn't always so clear-cut, and that anyone can be a victim of racism regardless of their race or their social status.
Exactly. And having a broader understanding of what racism is, well, that's crucial if we're going to really grasp the complexities of hate crimes and make sure all victims are recognized and supported equally.
The case also sparked a lot of debate about whether the way the media covers racially motivated crimes is influenced by the race of the victim and the perpetrator.
You're right. There was a lot of discussion about how the English media specifically handled the case. Some felt they didn't focus enough on the racial aspect because the perpetrators were of Pakistani origin.
It raises concerns about whether certain narratives, especially those that challenge the existing power structures, whether they receive less attention or are framed in a way that minimizes the role of prejudice.
It's a valid concern. It highlights the need for media outlets to be more aware of their own biases and to really push for balanced, accurate reporting, no matter the race or ethnicity of the people involved.
It's also a reminder that we, as consumers of media, need to be aware of these potential biases ourselves. We should seek out information from a variety of sources to ensure we're getting a full and accurate understanding of what happened.
Absolutely. We shouldn't rely on a single narrative to understand complex issues like racism and hate crimes. Critical thinking is key. We need to question our assumptions, be open to different perspectives, and be willing to challenge our own preconceived notions.
This case also brought the issue of gang violence to the forefront. The sources mentioned how the Shahid brothers, the ones behind Kriss's murder, were notorious in Pollock Shields for running a gang that terrorized the community.
That's right. And their actions in this case really highlight the destructive impact that gangs can have on communities. They create fear, they fuel violence, and they foster this dangerous sense of impunity.
It also raises questions about how effective our law enforcement strategies are when it comes to tackling gang activity and preventing these tragedies from happening in the first place.
Yeah, there was definitely debate after the Kriss Donald case about whether the police were hesitant to fully investigate Asian gangs. Maybe because they were worried about being perceived as racist. It points to this really difficult balance that law enforcement has to strike between addressing crime effectively and avoiding discriminatory practices.
It's such a complex issue, and there are no easy answers. But it definitely underscores the need for open dialogue between law enforcement and the communities they serve. We need community engagement. We need to build trust.
And we can't forget about the root causes of gang violence. We're talking about poverty, social exclusion, a lack of opportunities. Addressing those underlying factors is crucial.
Right, because just arresting gang members won't solve the problem if the social conditions that lead to the formation of gangs in the first place aren't addressed.
Exactly. A holistic approach is needed. One that combines effective law enforcement with social programs, community outreach, and initiatives aimed at preventing young people from joining gangs in the first place. We need to address the problem at its roots.
This case also had a significant impact on the individuals involved, even those beyond the immediate victims and perpetrators. The sources detail the risks taken by MP Mohammad Sarwar in securing the extradition of the Shahid brothers from Pakistan.
Yes, he received death threats and intense scrutiny for his role in bringing the killers back to Scotland to face justice. It was incredibly brave of him to take on that responsibility, knowing the potential cost.
It's a reminder that the pursuit of justice often requires individuals to take a stand, to speak out against wrongdoing, even when it's difficult or unpopular, to fight for what's right, even when it puts them at risk.
And this case also highlights how important international cooperation is, especially when it comes to dealing with crimes that cross borders. This case wouldn't have been solved without the collaboration between British and Pakistani authorities.
It shows that justice can reach beyond borders, and that working together is crucial in holding perpetrators accountable, no matter where they try to run and hide.
Absolutely. And that kind of cooperation is even more vital now than ever in our increasingly interconnected world where criminals can easily move across borders and exploit legal loopholes.
The Kriss Donald case had long-lasting effects on Imran Shahid too, the ringleader of the group. The sources talk about his time in prison, including the violence he experienced from other inmates, and his legal battles over solitary confinement.
That's right. His imprisonment wasn't just about serving his time. He became a target because of what he did, which really highlights the dangers that exist within the prison system itself and the complex relationships between inmates.
And his legal challenges regarding solitary confinement raise these difficult questions about how to balance the need to protect inmates with their basic human rights.
It's a tough balance to strike, for sure. Solitary confinement can be necessary at times to protect inmates from harm, but it can also have serious psychological consequences. It's a measure that should be used cautiously and only when absolutely necessary, with appropriate safeguards in place.
The Kriss Donald case, tragic as it was, offers some important insights into the complexities of hate crimes, the challenges of seeking justice, and the ongoing struggle to build a more just and compassionate society. It's a story that continues to resonate today.
It really does. And I think one of the things this case highlights is how much we need to understand these issues, racism and hate crimes, and to really have empathy for those affected by them. We have to challenge these prejudices wherever we see them.
It's about more than just getting a conviction in court, isn't it? It's about changing hearts and minds and creating a society where these kinds of things just don't happen.
You hit the nail on the head, and it's a constant process, not just a one-time thing. It's about recognizing those biases within ourselves and actively working against them. It's about speaking up when we see injustice. It's about educating ourselves and others about these issues.
It's a reminder that every single one of us has a role to play in creating that kind of world.
Absolutely. We can't just sit back and expect things to change on their own. It takes effort and it takes courage. But look at the examples we've seen. People like Mohammad Sarwar and Angela Donald. They showed incredible bravery in the face of truly horrific circumstances.
They refuse to let hate win.
Exactly. And their stories are a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and compassion can prevail.
The Kriss Donald case is a difficult story to process, but it's one that we should never forget. It's a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of hate, but it also offers a glimpse of the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of compassion.
You put it perfectly. It's a case that forces us to confront some of the most challenging aspects of humanity, but it also inspires us to strive for something better.
Well, I'm sure Simon and Tom will have some interesting insights about this case. Their weekly review show tomorrow, but in the meantime, we'll be back on Monday with another great true crime episode.